Day 47, The Vikings, and we watched the film in class, Terry Shappert's Viking Terror from the History Channel. Motivational guy, I always like watching him. But I want to break down the questions in a little more detail from class, and if you were absent, these are the answers to the questions. So the first thing they talked about was the geography of the Viking world, and this word fjords, which is a word you probably aren't familiar with, but fjords were covering Norway, so it was very difficult to bring unity to the people of Norway, and you can see it on a different scale. I mean, these big mountains just, separate the people. It's very reminiscent of the Greeks with the city-states, that geography separated the people. So it was hard to unify from the beginning, so they fought amongst themselves. And the way they would do it, they would lash their boats to each other and create these floating battlefields. So the Vikings, cut their teeth fighting-wise by fighting one another and these floating battlefields, very difficult way to fight. And the Vikings eventually developed this longboat, and here's an artist's rendering of the longboat, and with the very ornate carvings and the sail and the rowing in unison. Here's some archaeological evidence to what it looked like. So you can see the reality and the artist's rendering very similar. And the Viking boat was super quick, and it was able to go to places where there was even shallow water, so you could take it just about anywhere. So very maneuverable, very quick. The Vikings were very efficient. They ran 2 crews, so they could be the most efficient in traveling where they had to go. And the word Viking actually was a verb, a viking, which meant sea raid. And these, Scandinavian farmers decided we can make some money by traveling and taking other people's stuff. So they went to Viking, and now they're called Vikings. And the Vikings perfected the axe, and we can see the various axe heads that they used. So for instance, this one here would be used more as a tool to trim timbers to make boats, for instance. This one here is a throwing axe that you can throw it at great distance and use it this way. This is a Dane axe, very long, very lengthy, and using it in that respect. You see the hammer back. Here's a battle axe. So you can see they were very, very creative in how they created their axe heads, and there's an axe head for whatever use, from small to big to tool to weapon. So the Vikings were the masters of the axe, clearly. And the Viking Age began in 793 AD when the Vikings took off from Scandinavia and wound up at a monastery called Lindisfarne. And these monks were not armed, and there were plenty of artifacts, Christian artifacts, and it was easy pickings for the Vikings. And you can see the archaeological commemoration of the Vikings attack, and here's an artist's rendering. And these monks were unarmed. It wasn't even a fair fight, but it really gave the Vikings a taste of fairly how easy it was to get wealthy, and they had no respect for Christianity. They weren't Christians, and it was easy pickings for the Vikings. It started in 793. Now, to become a Viking, you had to go through a ritual. So first of all, you had to prove yourself as a warrior, and then they would have a ceremony where they would conjure Odin, the highest of the Viking gods, and you would cut your hand open and mix the blood with your brothers and engage in a duel with another warrior to prove that you were strong enough and tough enough and to join this brotherhood. And these horns were blown and fire, and it was very ritualistic, and that's how you became a Viking. And the Vikings had no fear. They felt their deaths were preordained, that they were going to die at a set time in a set way. There's nothing they could do about it, and they knew if they died in battle, they went to Valhalla, which was Viking heaven, that Odin would take them off the field, and they would live among the gods. So the mentality was without fear, and the mentality was that fighting is synonymous with heaven, so I'm going to fight pretty good, as you can imagine. Now, why did the Vikings leave Scandinavia to plunder? Again, it's very hard to farm, Denmark, Norway here, and Sweden here. It's very difficult. So they left for economic gain. They left for glory. To be a great Viking, you needed to get out there, conquer somebody, bring back treasure, and that made you renowned, and they felt you could live forever. So you can see from Scandinavia, they beat up the British Isles really good. Here's Ireland, Scotland, England, the coast of France, and Germany and Belgium. Made it all the way to the Middle East, to Constantinople and the Caspian Sea. Made it all the way to Vinland, which is modern-day Nova Scotia in Canada, to Greenland. I mean, the Vikings were incredibly well-traveled in their 300 years of their Viking Age. And they were able to make metal from the bogs that were there. Now, these bogs, they could take the soil, and even though this is a Roman invention, they could heat up this soil, this peat moss, and they would heat it up, and they would hit it and put it back and hit it. And you can see this is a tourist attraction, Oh my God, Mommy, Dad, look at that. They're making metal. So this is a modern, and they're reenacting this. But the fact that the Vikings were able to take peat moss and turn it into steel, these were not savages. These were very bright people to get the most out of their land, which did not have a lot of natural resources. And obviously their shipbuilding showed a great degree of intelligence and engineering and proficiency and all that good stuff. Now, to the Viking, the most important part of their boat was the sail. Now, the sail was more valuable than the rest of the boat combined, and they mastered it. It is not a Viking invention. It was, the sail was invented all the way back to our first civilization, the Mesopotamians, but they were experts with it and able to traverse the Atlantic Ocean and all of their travels. So the sail was key, and the Viking sail, you can see it here. Now, the Vikings' helmet showed cultural diffusion. Now, this one here is incredibly ornate from the early time. Probably, the head man in charge is wearing this. This is not for everybody, but as they would travel and as they learned some things, they would learn some. For instance, this one's more simplistic. This one, you can see the Byzantine influence. So the Vikings were sharp enough to tap into cultural diffusion, this notion we learn from others and we improve ourselves by learning from others. And the Vikings show that through their helmets. Now, one of the Vikings that's one of the more famous, there's many sagas of great Vikings. The Vikings on the History Channel, it's the sagas of Ragnar and Leif Erikson and Eric the Red. There's a bunch of them. But Olaf Tryggvason left Norway to attack England in 991 to unify Norway, which he did succeed. He didn't last long. He only lasted 3 years afterwards. So this unification of Norway really solidified this Viking power, and it was not easy, as I mentioned earlier, the geography, but Tryggvason was able to do so. And he did so at the Battle of Malden. And the Battle of Malden was when 4,000 Vikings clashed with 4,000 Saxon warriors. And the Vikings did win, and it was a decisive victory which allowed Norway to unify. And here's the historical perspective. Now, it's in England, and it says, this marks the site of the Battle of Malden. On and around this spot, an army of Danish raiders and the Essex army commanded by Earl Berthnoth fought on the 10th of August, 991 A.D. Berthnoth's heroic defeat and death became the subject of a great Anglo-Saxon poem. Now, if you were to see the historical account of this from Scandinavia, it would be a different account. So it's a friendly reminder, historical perspective. One event can happen, two people can see it very differently. And finally, what event brought the Viking Age to an end after 300 years? The conversion to Christianity. And we see the artist rendering of the Vikings giving up their Norse mythology to Christianity. And we can see some archaeological evidence, the Vikings carving of their depiction of Jesus. And that marked the Viking Age. So for 300 years, the Vikings were the most dominant force in the world. And to reiterate yesterday's class, an influence on our storytelling, an influence on our language, and I just think of very interesting people. So